Okay, thank you, Meta, for that very kind introduction, and thanks to the organizers for the invitation to come speak to you today. It's a great pleasure to be back in Toronto and have the opportunity to share with this audience some of my observations about things that I saw in the Caucasus during my sabbatical year there. The title of this presentation is Insights about the Ukraine Crisis. I think maybe in some ways the title was wrongly put. So whether what I'm offering are insights, I will let you judge. Certainly it's my observations and reflections. In addition, part of the motivation for choosing this topic today was that although the Ukraine crisis has been dominating the news for going on a year now, I have often thought that part of what is omitted from that discussion is how the Ukraine fits into broader issues in the post-Soviet region that I study. So I will talk about the Ukraine, and I will draw some analogies between its current problems and those of the Caucasus. However, I'm going to leave to some of my Toronto colleagues who study Ukraine much more intensively to comment on its internal politics in great detail. Some of those people would be, for example, my colleague Lucan Wei, Helena Yakovlev-Golani, and Paul Magoshi. So I think what I'm going to suggest is that, first of all, the Caucasus is similar in some interesting ways to the Ukraine in its political problems and its relations with Russia. Some of the same issues are playing out there. Another reason for me to present on this issue is that I've just spent some time in the Caucasus, and while I was there, I was disappointed by Canada's rather minimal presence in that region. So we have excellent diplomats, and I've met the Canadian diplomats who represent us in the Caucasus. They're based in Ankara. It's a pity that Canada's international presence doesn't match the quality of our diplomats or our potential contributions to the world. As a result of that, though, I'm in the fortunate position of having spent some time in a region that is of great importance to all of us and can comment on it in a way that few Canadian officials can at the moment. The same might be true, for example, of my colleague Ed Schatz, who works on Central Asia. So, first of all, let me just talk a bit about why I was in the Caucasus, in case you're wondering, and what I'm not going to talk about today, which is my own research, which is mainly on, as Meta said, policing reform and other issues related to public order and security in the Caucasus, and particularly in the Republic of Georgia, which has had some very unusual policy changes over the years since independence in 1991. I'm happy to talk more about that if people are curious. But maybe just let me say that I was in Tbilisi, Georgia, the capital of Georgia, from roughly last November until this July with some breaks, and I also traveled around a bit and spent some time in Armenia and somewhat less time in Azerbaijan. So I'm interested in the whole Caucasus, although I spent much more time in Georgia. So let me proceed with the presentation on the Caucasus and Ukraine. I'm going to try to address a few related themes in today's talk. One is, what can we gain as observers of Ukraine, or how can we add to our understanding of Ukraine and its current problems from examining political trends in the Caucasus? And in particular, I think there are two sub-questions that I'd like to address. One is Russia's motivations and strategy, what it's trying to achieve and how in the post-Soviet region, and the nature of ethnic conflict, not just in Ukraine, but all over the post-Soviet world. The second and related broad theme I'm going to try to address is how the Ukraine crisis itself is playing out in the Caucasus. So part of my gripe about how the Ukraine crisis is covered in the media in this country and elsewhere in the West is not just that it's viewed in isolation from trends elsewhere in the post-Soviet region, but that its effects on other countries in that region are not necessarily given enough attention. And so I will talk a bit about how the Ukraine crisis appears to be affecting both international politics and domestic politics in the Caucasus. And finally, I will talk a bit about how we, however you choose to define that we, Canada, the Canadian government, Canadian citizens, Western countries, should be responding to what's going on in both the Caucasus and Ukraine. Among other points I'm going to argue, I'm going to say that by comparing the events in the Caucasus and Ukraine, a particular picture emerges of Russia's goals in the post-Soviet region. And what I'll say is that that picture is that the goals tend to be more assertive rather than defensive. So as I'm going to describe in more detail in a minute, there's kind of a debate going on in both policy and academic circles as to whether Russia's goals are essentially trying to contain damage to itself or defend itself against major threats, or whether it really has more ambitious goals. So I will suggest that they're more ambitious or assertive rather than defensive. I'm also going to suggest that the unfolding events in Ukraine are influencing similar events in the Caucasus by promoting instability, undermining the ability of Western governments to influence events there, and in some ways probably leading to more regressive domestic politics as well. So let me just continue with a few maps. So this is a map of the Caucasus region. And just to clarify, in my presentation today, I'm not going to talk very much about the area that's shown in the map as kind of pale beige, which is often referred to as the North Caucasus. So the Caucasus itself is a kind of mountain range that runs through this isthmus here. Part of the region is in the Russian Federation, including the republics of Dagestan, Chechnya, and other places that we now know about because of their very severe security problems and ongoing insurgency. I'm happy to talk a bit about that part of the Caucasus if people are curious. Just in the interests of keeping my presentation fairly contained and clear, I'm not going to say much about it in my main remarks, which will be dedicated more to the three so-called South Caucasus republics of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And I'll tell you more about all of those in a second. This is a map of Ukraine, and as you can see, the Ukraine also borders the Black Sea, like Georgia. So these countries are not that far from each other. The map shows the Crimea, which was the first focal point of the Ukraine crisis, and then also shows the region around Donetsk and Lugansk, and this area of eastern Ukraine, which is the current focus. Finally, just to give you a synoptic view of the whole region, here is a map showing the Black Sea. So interestingly, although the Caucasus and Ukraine were both parts of the former Soviet Union, maybe we should also remember that there are other local actors that are very involved here, including Turkey, which are neighbors and increasingly participants in these political controversies. So I'm going to just share a few very basic details about the three Caucasus republics without going into too much detail. But again, if people have particular questions, I'm happy to say more about them. So all three of these republics were parts of the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union and became independent in 1990-91. The one where I spent the most time, Georgia, also happens to be the one that's most politically pro-Western and has had the most successful democratic transition to date. So in 2012, an event happened that's still very unusual in the post-Soviet region, which is that a sitting government lost an election and voluntarily surrendered power. At first, this was a change of government in the parliament only. Georgia has a mixed parliamentary presidential system. And then thereafter, the ruling party also lost the presidential election. So a complete democratic transition has happened there. In contrast, the other two countries are in different political circumstances. Armenia does have a parliament which contains some opposition members and a certain degree of pluralism and openness in its public life. At the same time, it's highly dominated by the government in a number of ways, and there are close links between the government and major economic actors. And there hasn't been the same kind of clear democratic transition or change of power there that we've seen in Georgia. Azerbaijan is now on its second president, hailing from the Aliyev family. And it's in some ways both the most closed politically of these three regimes. In other ways, it's also highly strategic for the West, both because it is itself a source of oil, and also because of the possibility of transporting natural gas across it through Georgia and to Turkey and from there into Europe, which has been catching the attention of policymakers in both North America and Europe. So these countries have really interesting cultures. They're all well worth a visit. I wish I could tell you more about that. I'm happy to tell you more about that if you'd like. Unfortunately, I'm here today to talk about their problems. So I'm going to just focus on a few very dangerous so-called frozen conflicts in the region. They're called that because all these conflicts I'm about to describe emerged in the early post-Soviet period or late Soviet period. And although they are not currently the site of military operations, with a partial exception I'll get to in a second, they are very tense, and the political status of the regions I'm about to mention has not been fully resolved. So the first one I'm going to mention is this area that's shown here in gray and white lines, Nagorno-Karabakh, which is currently ruled by a de facto independent government that is closely linked to the government of Armenia. Now, in the Soviet period, this region was actually an autonomous district within Azerbaijan. Although the majority of the population in Nagorno-Karabakh was ethnically Armenian, there was an Azeri minority. It was a very tense situation. And in the late 1980s, as those of us of a certain age can remember, this was actually the place where the first large-scale protests or the first large-scale sort of violent events that heralded the disintegration of the Soviet Union began. So none of us had ever heard of this region at the time, and yet it was here that a conflict between the local Armenian community and the government of Azerbaijan, eventually involving the Soviet government, which failed to contain it, helped stimulate the breakup of the USSR. So this was followed by an ethnic conflict involving Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Azerbaijan, which eventually turned into an interstate conflict. Just to summarize a lot of events, Armenia won the military phase of that conflict. However, the independence of Nagorno-Karabakh has not been recognized either by Azerbaijan or by any other state. I'll say more about that later in my presentation. The two other ongoing conflicts that I'd like to bring to your attention involve Georgia and its ethnic minorities, and also Russia as an interested party. So the larger one is here, this area called Abkhazia, which is on the Black Sea. And this is said to be one of the most beautiful parts of the former Soviet Union. I haven't been there. It's very difficult to go there as a Westerner. It was actually the location where a lot of the Soviet elite had their summer houses in the USSR, and including Stalin's dacha. So the Soviet leader Stalin had his summer house there too. It was the scene of an extremely violent ethnic conflict in the early 1990s, in which a local ethnic minority, the Abkhaz, backed by Russia, fought and defeated the Georgian government, which was followed by the expulsion of the ethnic Georgian community in that region, Abkhazia. So since then, Abkhazia has, again, like Nagorno-Karabakh, been de facto independent. It has made some efforts to achieve recognition from other states. Russia has recognized it, but very few other countries have done so. Only a few islands in the South Pacific and some Central American states recognize its independence. And the third and smallest one is this region called South Ossetia, which again has a local ethnic minority who are not Georgian and are allied with Russia and secured their independence or their de facto independence in roughly the same manner. So maybe one point to just draw your attention to is that the scale here is not very large. So this is, let's see, the pen is roughly 100 miles. So you can see that from Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, to that de facto independent South Ossetia is really not at all far, and you can easily run into the border if, with a very short drive. So this is a very explosive region. And closer in time to us, you may remember the 2008 war involving Georgia and Russia. So the issues that were at stake in that war have not really been resolved, and that is part of why we should probably be concerned about the effects of the Ukraine crisis on the Caucasus. So, that was all by way of background. And now I'm going to continue by talking a bit about the Ukraine crisis and trying to understand it, and then bringing in some events from the Caucasus in order to gain some leverage on what's going on in Ukraine. And the basic approach I'm going to use is just, I was trained in social science, right? So I see these all as data points. They are all cases that we can draw on if we're going to be testing particular hypotheses about causation, right? So one of the issues we're trying to understand now, just not even as social scientists, but just as citizens, is what are the causes of the Ukraine crisis? And in particular, what are Russia's objectives there? So I'm going to try to bring in some data from the Caucasus to approach that answer better. So let me just summarize very, very briefly the events in the Ukraine crisis and where we are now, before raising some questions about it, and then going back to the Caucasus to see whether I can shed any light on events in Ukraine. So let's go back to last year, not actually almost a calendar year ago, November. What was going on? Well, the EU was involved in the final stages of negotiating a comprehensive agreement on association with several post-Soviet states. The jewel in the crown for this agreement was Ukraine, the largest of the states that was involved in these negotiations. It has a population of more than 40 million and borders the EU and is an important trade partner for the EU. 3 other states were also involved in these negotiations with the EU, one of which I'm not going to talk about very much today, Moldova. It eventually did sign this agreement. And 2 others. So one of those, which I will talk, both of which I'll talk about, one of those was Georgia, which also eventually signed, and the other was Armenia, which made a very surprising decision, which I'll get to in a few minutes. So everything seemed to be going according to plan. And the government of Ukraine, which was then headed by President Viktor Yanukovych, was not a particular favorite of the United States, the EU, or NATO. And in fact, Russia had been very happy when he had come into office after the period in which Ukraine was ruled by the previous president, Yushchenko, who was seen as much more pro-Western. So I think that for many people in the West, the crisis that unfolded in Ukraine at the beginning of November really caught us off guard. So what happened? Well, first in November, President Yanukovych announced that he was going to be canceling the planned association agreement with the EU. The association agreement would have promoted trade and also would have created certain advantages for Ukrainian citizens involving visa-free travel to the EU. So this was a shock, and it had immediate effects in Ukrainian politics. And the further background here is that Ukraine had not been doing particularly well in a number of respects for some years, so the economy had been performing very poorly, and there had also been a lot of dissatisfaction with the authoritarian governing style of President Yanukovych, who, among other things, had imprisoned the main opposition leader, Yulia Tymoshenko, and her imprisonment was also one of the key sticking points between the EU and Ukraine during the negotiations. And in fact, the EU announced it was really not going to back down on this, and that may have been what pushed Ukraine under Yanukovych finally against the decision to carry out the association agreement. In any case, the decision to cancel the agreement seems to have acted like a spark, and we then all observed the large protests in Kiev's Independence Square, the Maidan, which lasted 4 weeks and culminated in the horrific massacre in February, in which the protesters were shot on by government forces. This triggered a political crisis in Ukraine in which Yanukovych fled and for a while disappeared from the scene altogether before resurfacing in Russia. Actually, we haven't heard much from him recently. I'm not quite sure what he's up to these days. He was replaced by a transitional government and ultimately by the current president, Let's see, later in February, shortly after this, his ouster, we then saw the rapid separation of Crimea from Ukraine. So just some background here. Crimea, this is part of what was disputed in this whole story. Crimea is, like Ukraine, part of the former Soviet Union and a part of the former Russian Empire. In the early Soviet period, it was affiliated with the Russian Federation. And then in the 1950s, it was transferred to Ukraine. Now, so far so good. In the post-Soviet period, Russia actually recognized Ukraine's borders, and Ukraine permitted Russia to maintain a naval base in Crimea. At the same time, there was some dissatisfaction with Ukrainian government in Crimea, including some separatist sentiment, although exactly how much is highly disputed. The ethnic issues involved are complex. I'm going to talk more about them. The Russian claim is something like this. The people who live in Crimea are really ethnically Russian, and they didn't want to be part of Ukraine anyway, so the inclusion of Ukraine in Crimea was illegitimate, and if they want to leave, they should be allowed to leave. So I'm going to take issue with almost all those claims, but bear with me for now. I'm not going to go into the details. So as we all remember, because this was not that long ago, the Crimea events unfolded very rapidly with the seizure of some airports in the Crimea by men known as Little Green Men. It wasn't really clear who they were. Probably some of them are Russian troops. And with the in March, this part of the process reached a culmination when the legislature of Crimea, under rather murky circumstances, voted to authorize an independence referendum, which was then carried out. The independent side won. The government of Crimea asked to be annexed to Russia, and the Russian legislature agreed. No other government has recognized this annexation, as far as I know. Then the question was whether this would be the end of it. So if you go back to before around April, people were wondering, well, what more does the government of Russia, led by President Putin, want from Ukraine? So some people said, well, he's probably has enough for now. He's made his point. He's secured this highly strategic part of Ukraine, including his naval base. It turned out not to be enough, apparently, because beginning in roughly April, we've seen the expanding conflict in eastern Ukraine, again involving a very kind of murky combination of local supporters. Clearly some Russian soldiers are present of different kinds, and this has become easier to document recently as their deaths have been reported, and the Ukrainian government has displayed some identifying documents relating to them. And the Russian government itself has claimed it's not actually a party to this conflict. Interestingly, this is quite a contrast with the conflict in Georgia, which I'll come to in a second. So that's roughly where we are now. So we can say that, I guess to summarize, Crimea has been effectively detached from Ukraine, and large parts of southeastern Ukraine are contested, and the Ukrainian government's ability to carry out its policies there is quite limited. And of course, as an extremely important corollary, this has led to a lot of suffering and devastation. And the number of deaths in this conflict, although not on par with that in Syria or Iraq, is not trivial. So it's already a couple thousand. So it's comparable to the Gaza conflict earlier this year. And it's also led to a large-scale exodus of civilians from some of the affected areas, and of course economic devastation and hardship as well. All right, so here's the question I want to ask, and as I said, I'm going to leave a lot of issues about Ukrainian internal politics to better informed colleagues. I think if we start from the assumption that Russia clearly is involved in some ways, it certainly doesn't deny being involved in Crimea and in annexing Crimea. It does involve that it's waging war against the government of Ukraine, I think not very credibly, right? So this is my starting point. Then the question is, what is it that Russia really objected to? What led Russia to take these steps? And this has been a very controversial question. So I think I think the first theory, which I would say is probably not very viable, is that it really just objected to the ouster of Yanukovych, who was Russia's ally. So maybe this view had some viability early in the crisis, but Russia does not seem to be making very strenuous efforts to return Yanukovych to power. They do claim that his ouster was illegal and the current government of Ukraine is not really fully legitimate. But it seems rather thin as an explanation for this rather involved campaign of military offensive and an annexation against Ukraine. So what are the other possibilities? Well, I think we've heard two major schools of thought on this from both academics and the journalists and politicians. One is that what Russia really doesn't like is not so much the actual association agreement itself that Ukraine was preparing to sign with the EU, but rather the likely future consequences of that association. So some colleagues of mine, including my former dissertation advisor, Professor David Cameron at Yale, have pointed out that all or nearly all post-Soviet countries or post-communist countries that have joined the EU have eventually joined NATO. So this is a kind of slippery slope argument about how Russia is interpreting the likely future trajectory of events. So in this view, I guess the idea is that Russia thinks that an association with the EU, an association agreement between the EU and the EU and Ukraine, is probably a prelude to full-scale membership for Ukraine and other post-Soviet states at some point not very far down the road, and that in turn would not be the final stage of this process of detachment of the post-communist, post-Soviet states from Russia, but instead would lead to their incorporation into NATO and thus into a consolidated Western military and economic sphere of influence. So that's one school of thought. Another school of thought is that it's actually the association agreement itself, which Russia found unacceptable. So this is a bit interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, not many of us, certainly not I, was very aware of Russian dissatisfaction with the accession agreement right up until the final catastrophic events of last year when all this began unraveling. So in this view, you have to think, or people who hold this view presumably think, that what Russia doesn't like, what Russia cannot tolerate is a Ukraine that is integrated even economically and perhaps to some extent politically with the EU, and that NATO itself is not the main concern or is not the only thing that Russia objects to. Right? That for some reason Russia sees this association agreement as itself unacceptable, regardless of the possible accession of Ukraine to NATO. So of those two views, I think I'm going to argue more for the second one, and actually in a somewhat more extreme form than I just framed it. So, but to make that argument, I'm going to have to go back to some events in the Caucasus, which I think we may have lost sight of, and which I believe are related to these events in Ukraine and can shed light on the causality of processes unfolding in Ukraine. So these two events or phenomena are Georgia's conflicts with Russia and what I'm calling Armenia's U-turn on its own accession to the EU Association Agreement. So to take those in turn, let's go back just over 6 years ago to August 2008. Everyone was enjoying the Beijing Olympics. People in the US were following the presidential campaign. And then suddenly a short but very destructive war broke out between Russia and Georgia. And again, this war involved these separatist regions that I alluded to earlier, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Now, the government of Georgia's position was that these two regions had illegally seceded from their sovereign Georgia, and that it would never recognize their independence, and in theory they could be returned to Georgia by any means. So what exactly happened? Well, the events of August 2008 are actually quite controversial, and they were at the time. After the fact, a report commissioned by the EU said roughly the following. Well, Russia was clearly engaged in highly aggressive preparatory moves for war, such as troop movements, drone oversight of Georgian territory, and other threatening steps. But Georgia actually fired the first shot, and thus should be branded the aggressor. I personally don't agree with that interpretation of those events. I don't think it's that crucial that we get into it for this purpose. I will add, though, that certainly after the fact, Russia has repeatedly violated the agreements that it signed for the end of that war through the good offices of then French President Sarkozy. So, for example, it agreed to permit the return of displaced persons from parts of the separatist regions that had fled the conflict. It didn't do so. It also promised not to militarize the internal border between these two separatist regions and the rest of Georgia, and it then did so. So let's leave that, though, and just think about what was debated at the time quite hotly, just as it's being debated in Ukraine, which is what does Russia want, so to speak? What does President Putin want? What does the Russian government want? And again, or I guess earlier, we see two kinds of schools of thought emerging in both the policy and academic worlds. And these also correspond to some extent to divisions between Western governments. So on the one side, we have the governments of the US, the UK, Canada, and some other Northern European and Eastern European states, the Scandinavians and the Eastern European NATO members, who said who have been backing the admission to NATO, or the possible admission to NATO, of a number of post-Soviet states, including at the time Ukraine and Georgia. On the other hand, we had a coalition of, we could say, a number of other EU states led by Germany, France, and some Mediterranean countries such as Spain and Italy, who had opposed this planned admission of Georgia and Ukraine to NATO. And that latter group or faction had won out in the Bucharest NATO summit that took place earlier that year. So Georgia had gone to had requested what's called a membership action plan, which was basically a series of steps that would eventually lead to its receiving an offer of admission to NATO, which in turn would trigger a security guarantee between Georgia and other NATO countries, so that if Georgia was ever attacked, it would be other countries would be required to defend it. All right, so the sequence was, just to review again, that this planned accession of Georgia to NATO flopped. Shortly thereafter, the war broke out. And a lot of people thought there might be some kind of causation involved as well as correlation. And so two schools of thought, we could say roughly, I'm simplifying a lot, emerged. And again, these two schools of thought do to some extent map onto the foreign policies of the governments that I just mentioned, and academics as well. So one school of thought said, this is all the doing of NATO. NATO has destabilized this region through its plans to admit Georgia, and Ukraine at the time was also on the cards. And it's just needlessly provocative to Russia to try to expand this NATO alliance into other post-Soviet countries around Russia. And the result of this attempt has been to inflame Russian concerns or anxieties. And so really, leaving aside the question of whether Georgia or Russia fired the first shot, the whole plan of NATO enlargement here was really the problem. In this school of thought, the West should avoid doing this kind of thing again, so be careful about, take care not to extend offers of admission to NATO to other post-Soviet countries. And as a related matter, should not back local leaders who are perceived as too anti-Russian or too provocative to Russia, such as the then president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili. Other people said no. actually, it's more the contrary, that NATO has seized, that the failure of NATO accession is really more the cause of the war in another way, in that it essentially gave Russia the green light for it to pursue its vendetta against Georgia. I would say that, certainly politically speaking, the first school of thought won out. So the school that said that NATO accession is bad because it is inflammatory and destabilizing, it won out within NATO, and a lot of people in the EU also accepted this view, and maybe a lot of academics as well. Now, the corollary of this claim, however, was that other things short of NATO expansion would not be as inflammatory, right? So what's the problem with NATO from Russia's perspective in this school of thought? The problem is that NATO is a military alliance which has a history of antagonism with Russia and the Soviet Union before it, and whose major function, by its own admission, or at least the views of a number of its policymakers, is to defend its members against Russia. So in this view, if you let a country into NATO that borders Russia, it's really intrinsically threatening to Russia, and that's wrong. But, to continue the thought, it's not necessarily wrong, or at least not for the same reason, to try to integrate those countries into other Western arrangements, such as the European Union, right? So the European Union is not currently a military alliance in exactly the same way as NATO. Its military capacity is very limited. Its capacity to even project policies externally as a single political actor is not as developed as that of a state. And so in this view, some people who took this view would say, well, all these countries would like to be integrated into the EU, many of them, and could benefit from it. So they could benefit from increased trade and from their citizens being able to visit Europe without a visa. And they could benefit from political cooperation with the EU, which might promote democratization in these post-Soviet societies. Let's not object to, or there's no reason to object to EU expansion in the same way that we object to NATO expansion. It's a different question. And I think that was the predominant school of thought in a lot of EU countries, and probably a lot of NATO countries, and I suspect, although I can't prove this, in the Obama administration, right? And Obama came into office convinced that George Bush had botched a lot of things in the world, including relations with Russia. And my impression is that he was not that engaged in this question of the exact future status of post-Soviet countries, so that when these events began in Crimea last year or in Ukraine, everyone was thrown for a curve. So the reading I'm proposing is that, in effect, the view that EU accession is not bad and NATO accession is bad was the politically predominant view in a lot of Western policy circles, and is why it was possible for the EU to pursue these association agreements with a number of post-Soviet states. So let me just go back to the map again to show you which ones I have in mind. So the four post-Soviet states which were to be included in the current round of the EU association agreement were Moldova, up there in the kind of left middle top, Ukraine, Georgia, and then Armenia, which is just visible there on the edge. Sorry, there you go, right? Okay, so this was going on for a number of years, and nobody, certainly not you or I, was paying much attention because it was sort of assumed that we'd solved this issue, right? The problem was that NATO expansion is destabilizing, but EU expansion is not, so let's let EU expansion roll. Okay, so I'm going to leave Georgia's wars and move on to another strange, even stranger incident that took place just last year and attracted very little attention in the West, which is the Armenian government's very surprising and abrupt U-turn on the question of its own accession to this EU association agreement. Okay, so I'm going to do a little informal survey. Who here remembers this event? Raise your hands high. Okay, we have 4 or 5, 6 people, right? So, and I'm sure this is a very unusual audience, right? So most Canadians were not paying attention to the fact that the government of Armenia decided not to pursue association agreement with the EU.
When did it happen?
I'll get to that in a second. So Why is that? Well, I think it's because in North America, and probably to a lesser extent in Western Europe, we're just not that focused on the Caucasus as an area of Western Russia relations, or in general, right? The Ukraine is just seen as a much more politically salient part of the world, including in Canada for a number of reasons, including its relations with the US and NATO, but also probably because of the Ukrainian community here. So there was very little attention to this story. So let me summarize what had happened. The Armenian government under President Serge Sarkisyan had been saying for a number of years it was going to go through with the succession agreement. And the argument was something like this. Look, we're not interested in NATO at all. We've never been interested in NATO. This is not even on the table. Let's not talk about NATO. Who cares? In fact, just to give you further background, in the Caucasus, Armenia is usually seen as the most pro-Russian of the three Caucasus republics. And it has managed to hold on to Karabakh in part through Russian backing, a fact which has caused a lot of displeasure in Azerbaijan. So no government of Armenia has ever said that it wants to pursue NATO membership. And the president of Armenia, when he was announcing a policy of trying to pursue the association agreement with the EU, explicitly said, this is not our objective, we don't want NATO membership. What he did say was, well, we do most of our trade with the EU, so we'd probably really benefit from a free trade agreement. And since, as I've just told you, this is not a political matter or a military matter, it's just an economic one, nobody else should care. So he had been affirming that Russia would remain Armenia's main defense partner, and nothing would change except for this association agreement. And the signing was expected at a big summit in Vilnius to be held shortly thereafter. So this is all last summer. So then what happened? President Sarkisyan was on vacation, I think in Croatia, in some Mediterranean villa probably, and then was requested to report to the Kremlin urgently for a meeting with President Putin, which he did, which in turn presumably says something about the nature of relations between those two states. We don't know exactly what was said at that meeting, but what we do know is that when President Sarkisyan emerged from it, he said that he had changed his mind completely. So he said, well, I've changed my mind. Our economic association should probably follow our military association. So not only are we not going to join this EU association agreement, but in fact, we're going to join something else instead, which is often called the Eurasian Customs Union or the Eurasian Union, which is an entity that currently consists of 3 countries, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, and is supposed to come into being fully shortly and entail a kind of free trade agreement between its members. What exactly the future will bring, so for example, does this mean that the ruble will become the currency of all these countries? All this is still being debated or discussed, but it's certainly envisaged at a minimum as a free trade area in the same way that the EU is or that NAFTA is, a customs union in the same way that the EU is and NAFTA is not, and probably a political association as well. Now, the fact that this is a customs union is itself also very important. Let me just make a little digression here to explain the distinction that I find very confusing between a free trade agreement and a customs union. So Canada and the United States have a free trade agreement. This means that we basically eliminated a lot of tariffs between our 2 countries, right? And given each other very favorable trading terms as trade partners. It does not mean, though, that either Canada or the United States is prevented from pursuing similar agreements with other partners, right? So right now, Canada is in the final stages of pursuing a similar trade agreement with the EU. This is not prevented by NAFTA. In contrast, the customs union kind of arrangement that the EU currently has and that is envisaged for the post-Soviet region is different and more exclusive. What it means is that customs barriers are fully abolished between the member states, and they then become a single bargaining unit in terms of their relations with the rest of the world. So the members give up their right to pursue other free trade agreements. By saying that Armenia would no longer be, would not enter the EU accession agreement now, and in fact would enter the Eurasian Union, so President Sargsyan in effect said it would never enter any kind of free trade agreement with the EU, and the EU then suspended any kind of free trade negotiations with him for the reason that I just mentioned, that there's really no point. Okay, so what happened? Well, we just saw basically the president of this region, of this republic, be summoned to Moscow. He announces this U-turn on his country's future trade agreements. There were protests in Armenia, and I was there shortly thereafter after they had been dispersed, shall we say. They were not on the scale of those in Ukraine, but there is an internal debate within Armenia about the extent to which this agreement with Russia is desirable. I can say more about that if people are curious. But now I'd like to try to integrate the data that we've just outlined and see whether we can come to some conclusions, or at least rule out some explanations, or tentatively settle on certain hypotheses to explain what's going on. So remember that the question I started with is, what does Russia want in Ukraine, from Ukraine, and what are more broadly, its goals in the post-Soviet region? And what turns on this, I guess, is the causation of the Ukraine crisis that we're seeing now. All right, so now what about the school of thought that holds that this is really all about NATO expansion, which emerged in the wake of the 2008 war in Georgia? Well, I think that people who made that argument have just been shown to be wrong, or at least their claim is much, much weaker. Why is that? Because if we only had Georgia in 2008 to look at, we could all argue about what was going on in Georgia, or between Georgia and Russia, right? And the exact causes of that war. And people who said this is all because of NATO and its plans for expansion, they could point to the fact that Georgia was very gung-ho for NATO membership, Russia opposed it, and then a war broke out. This is a perfectly reasonable, intrinsically perfectly reasonable argument that proceeds by inductive analysis. Now, however, the situation is different. We now have more data. And I think that people who want to make this claim have to come to grips with and address some, shall we say, disconfirmatory evidence. I would argue that both Ukraine and Armenia suggest that NATO membership per se is really not the key issue. Armenia even more clearly, but Ukraine to some extent also, right? So let's go back to Ukraine first, the weaker part of this. In 2013, Ukraine was not led by a government that was interested in pursuing NATO membership. This was not on the table. And it was not exactly off the table in the same dramatic way that it was in Armenia, but certainly nobody in the Ukrainian government under Yanukovych was saying, we want NATO membership, and that will be the next step. So it's very different from Georgia, right? In Georgia, they were saying, we want NATO membership now, the sooner the better, please, let's be members of NATO, and then there was this war. In Ukraine, that just didn't happen. So it's harder to claim, even on the basis of Ukraine, that what Russia objects to is the possibility of NATO membership. Okay, so I've had this debate with other colleagues, and some of them have said, well, but what about the point I mentioned earlier, that a lot of post-communist countries that have joined the EU have ultimately joined NATO? And here's what I would say to that. I would say that this is where the Armenia case really becomes quite important, right? Because Armenia is, as I just mentioned, an extremely politically pro-Russian state. It's allied with Russia militarily. It depends on Russia to protect it against its neighbor Azerbaijan, with which it has this ongoing conflict. And its president said again and again very clearly he was not interested in NATO membership and Russia is his ally. So I think that if you want to claim that Russia is really afraid of NATO membership for any of these countries, to me that argument seems to have been weakened by these events, right? Here we have a government that just says, we just want free trade with the EU so we can sell them our tomatoes or whatever. NATO is not on the table. We don't want NATO. We don't want it. We don't want it. So if one of you, for example, wants to tell me that this is really all about NATO, I think you have a pretty hard case to make. And that means a couple of things. So first of all, it means that going back to the war in 2008, that explanation is probably less likely to be true. And with respect to Ukraine, it's probably also less likely to be true. All right, so what are the other possibilities? Well, there's actually an interesting distinction between the Ukrainian and Armenian cases that I don't recall seeing analyzed fully yet, although I haven't necessarily been on the lookout for this. It's that in Ukraine, when President Yanukovych backed out of the accession agreement, the association agreement, he did not say that he wanted to join the Eurasian Customs Union. Whereas in Armenia, those two statements were linked right away. So I think there is a legitimate question as to why one of those two states did such an abrupt U-turn and the other only did a partial U-turn. So in Ukraine, what Yanukovych said was roughly, this is not the right time. I'm not going to go ahead with this agreement with the EU now. Let's see what the future brings. He did not say we're going to join the Eurasian Customs Union right away. So I think one could argue, right, that EU accession is the real problem, or even EU association. The Armenian case, however, makes that a little harder to substantiate, right? Because in Armenia we have a case where Russia seems to put a lot of pressure on the government of Armenia, not just not to join this association agreement now, right, as in Ukraine, which was the immediate outcome in the Ukraine crisis, but on the contrary, to actually team up with Russia and its other partners to join this new customs union that Armenia had said it really didn't want to be a part of, right? Armenia said, no, our trade is with the EU. That's our natural trading partner. We want to emphasize that. So why is this? Well, I think this remains to be ascertained. One interpretation is that Armenia is much easier to push around than Ukraine, or that Armenian public opinion is more sympathetic to this alternative. I don't have an answer for this question. I think it's easier to say what Russia's motivations are not than what they are, right? So I no longer find this argument about NATO very convincing. Whether what Russia really objects to is just the EU and all its works, or whether it wants something more, right, such as ultimately the accession of all its post-Soviet neighbors into this customs union, I think that's still an open question. But with that said, I will tell you a bit more about what I don't know about what its underlying motivations are, right? So if you think that at a minimum Russia does not want its post-Soviet neighbors to join the EU or any kind of EU association, and or it may also want them to join its customs union, and it's willing to pursue these objectives through a policy of destabilizing and essentially attacking Ukraine, which has costed a lot politically, what does it want? Well, I've heard a number of arguments about this, and I will just present them to you without endorsing any of them, and let you decide. So one is what we might call the geopolitical argument, which is that President Putin is determined to recreate, if not the Soviet Union as a state, at least a political entity in Eurasia that's dominated by Russia and that is capable of projecting Russian power around the world in a way that is very similar to that of the Soviet Union. That's just one formulation of that argument. Other formulations are possible. Another argument, and interestingly, I've heard all of these in the Caucasus when I was there earlier this year, so they're all circulating there. People are thinking about them. Is that really the reason for Russia's extreme retaliation against Ukraine following the ouster of Yanukovych has to do with Russia's own internal domestic politics. And on this reading, until this Ukraine crisis broke out, President Putin was actually losing popularity steadily, and the Russian economy was not doing very well. So the argument here might be something like this, that either President Putin decided that a conflict with Ukraine would be politically advantageous, or in a more modest formulation, he couldn't afford to be seen to give up Ukraine, right? That this would be too politically damaging and would make him look weak in an environment in which he was already politically weak. Now, I had some sympathy for that point of view until President Putin followed up on his success in Crimea with the destabilization of eastern Ukraine, right? So if you think that what President Putin just needed was some kind of face-saving victory on a minor scale, right, then you would think maybe Crimea would be enough. Apparently it wasn't enough. So I'll leave that question open. A third argument, which is, I would say, the least common of these, although I've also heard this from people in the post-Soviet region, is economic. So here the argument would be something like the following. Russian economic reforms have not been very successful. Russia is still mainly a natural resources exporter. Its industries are non-competitive. And it's very threatened by the possibility that its neighbors could enter into more productive trading agreements with other blocs, such as the EU. And so, in fact, the real goal of this is to create a kind of Russian-dominated economic sphere. So here's a funny anecdote that I heard. Georgia, where I stayed, used to do a thriving business in re-exporting used cars from Europe into other post-Soviet states. And in fact, there are various used car markets you can go to in Georgia where people come from all over the post-Soviet region and buy their cars and then drive them away or have them shipped. And Kazakhstan used to be a major customer of these used Mercedes or whatever. Then Kazakhstan entered this new Russian-dominated customs union, and it had to stop buying used European cars that people were purchasing in Georgia. Thus, in effect, making it much more difficult for Kazakh consumers to find alternatives to the Russian cars that they would otherwise buy, which are not of very high quality. Okay, so this is one argument, right? So you can take your pick. I think these are all possible. I would only add that it seems to me most likely that it's some combination, right? That some combination of these motivations is involved, and also that there's some element of evolution or adaptation, right? So we can't know exactly what's in the mind of President Putin and his advisors. We can surmise that he may have some longer-term strategic objectives, right? Going back to the question of why Ukraine was not required to immediately join this customs union, whereas Armenia was. Maybe he sees that as a long-term priority or a long-term goal, but not an immediate requirement. And of course, as in any political context, it would be unwise to imagine that everything has been planned out in advance, right? So President Putin could not have foreseen the exact chain of circumstances that led to the downfall of Yanukovych. He did respond pretty quickly, but certainly his policies have been evolving and reacting. Excuse me for 1 second. Okay, so, I think this is all interesting, but a bit speculative. I think for me, the main conclusion I would like to suggest to you is that the argument about NATO expansion as the root of all evil in this region is no longer very viable and really has to be discarded. Or if people want to maintain this, they have a lot of counter-arguments and counter-evidence that they need to overcome. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to the second part of my presentation, where I talk less about trying to interpret events in the Ukraine and more about what I observed in the Caucasus. So what I'm going to describe is not exactly the subject of my research, which, as I said, is more about domestic law enforcement issues. But I will tell you what I could see as an observer in Georgia and to a lesser extent these other Caucasus republics about what we might call the ripples from the Ukraine crisis across the Black Sea in the Caucasus. And we're going to focus on three main issues. One is the position of these republics with respect to Western and Russian and other international partners. Another is the extent to which the Ukraine crisis is influencing the local ethnic or international conflicts that I mentioned earlier. And the third is the development of the internal politics of these three countries. And I'm going to argue that in all of these domains, the effects of the Ukraine crisis have been rather negative so far, at least from the perspective of the West as a political entity, so to speak, or of people who would like to see a democratic evolution and a nonviolent evolution in the Caucasus. So on the first point, when I was in Tbilisi, it's not that people are panicking, right? People are still going about their daily lives. There are Russian troops 50 miles away, and that's kind of alarming, but you get used to it. It's more that if you talk to policymakers and academics who are involved in security issues, I would say that after a while they started to get a certain kind of haunted look when you brought up the subject of Ukraine. This is very scary for them, right? Why? Well, I think for a number of reasons. First of all, maybe it's easy for us to forget that all these countries exist in a certain kind of ecology, right? They're all post-Soviet states which are trying to negotiate their relations with Russia to one degree or another in ways that are not to Russia's liking very much, with the partial exception of Armenia. And Georgia is probably, of these states, the one that has been most assertive in refusing to be part of a Russian-dominated alliance or sphere of influence. So to some extent, this is very alarming for Georgian officials and policymakers and thoughtful citizens because it suggests that even if Russia, for the sake of argument, did nothing to change its policies in the Caucasus, if Russia succeeds in installing a more compliant Ukrainian government, this will weaken the capacity of other post-Soviet states to be genuinely independent of Russia. This is the argument I heard again and again, that when you see Georgians waving the Ukrainian flag, it's not just out of sympathy, that's of course part of it, but it's also out of enlightened self-interest. They see that their viability as an independent state is linked to that of Ukraine. There's another dimension to this too, which is that the success of Russia in imposing a solution in Ukraine through force, of course, is a precedent for what could happen in the Caucasus. And that's why all these governments are looking very closely at the Western response to the annexation of Crimea and the destabilization through armed intervention of eastern Ukraine. And I would say that I talked to a number of officials in all these countries, and they all, without reservation, were disgusted by the failure to prevent Russia from doing this. You could ask them, well, what exactly do you want? Do you want us to have a nuclear war with Russia? They would say no. I think they would say, though, that the sanctions that were introduced were not adequate to deter Russia and have not made the point that Russia has anything to lose by this kind of policy. And maybe even rhetorically, I think many of them would say that the level of condemnation that Russia received was not really sufficient given the degree of the infraction. So I think, to make a long story short, one result of the conflict in Ukraine in the Caucasus has been that I think in all three post-Soviet governments, the West in general, to the extent that this is specifically military, NATO, the United States, but also the Europeans, look weaker and less appealing as partners for a number of reasons. So if they won't protect you, then why do you need them? If Russia is going to be the boss in the region anyway, and maybe it's more to your advantage to come to terms with Russia. So that's one of the results I've observed. Another is that there are, I think, so far still potential, but rather concerning possibilities for intensification and maybe violent activization of the frozen conflicts that I mentioned earlier in the Caucasus. So, beginning with the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, nobody pays attention to this in Canada because nothing seems to be happening. But in fact, you should be very, very afraid. There is not an all-out war there now, but the border is closed, there is shelling across it, soldiers get killed. It's very, very tense. So I think this is comparable to maybe, I don't know, the border between Israel and Gaza or some other highly inflamed region of the world. This is not a joke. The other longer-term development is that Azerbaijan, which has a lot of oil, has been investing hugely in its defense budget and now basically dominates the whole region as a military hegemon. Armenia has been struggling economically and simply can't keep up. So what are the effects, or what have we observed in this conflict over the Karabakh region since the Ukraine crisis broke? Well, a couple of things. The Azerbaijan government has been making much harsher statements in public about its intentions toward this region. So they always said, this is ours, we're going to get it back eventually. But now they're making statements more like, it's going to happen really soon, and you better watch out. So What's going on? Well, some observers, and I think that this is a plausible argument, have suggested that in a funny way, Azerbaijan has actually benefited indirectly from the Ukraine crisis because it now appears to be a more important partner for the EU and the West in general. And that in particular goes back to the question of natural gas transit that I mentioned earlier, right? So one alternative to Russia as a supplier of natural gas to European markets is to bring them in from Central Asia via the Caucasus. So one argument I've seen is that perhaps because of that, or perhaps simply politically, Azerbaijan is feeling like it's in a very strong bargaining position and is now going to be more insistent on resolution of the Karabakh question to its satisfaction. And by the way, Azerbaijani officials whom I've met some this summer, they made the argument that since you don't like Crimea being annexed by its neighbor, you must also not like Karabakh being annexed by its neighbor too. And yet, we don't really see this full court press to return Karabakh to us. So again, there's been a certain kind of both disenchantment with the West as a partner, maybe a somewhat more defiant attitude, a sense that the West is not really very reliable. Whether that will mean sort of intensification or deepening of contacts with Russia remains to be seen. Returning to the ethnic conflicts in Georgia, it's a somewhat different situation. So in some ways, the conflict has already been solved in a very sad, tragic way through the effective secession of these regions from Georgia and the expulsion of the Georgian inhabitants from them. But it's not beyond the realm of possibility that these de facto borders could also become activated in a number of ways should Russia choose to do so. So one possibility that was being mooted when I was in Tbilisi is there is a small region of Abkhazia where the Georgian population, the ethnically Georgian population, was not expelled. It's called Gali district. And one nightmare scenario is that those remaining Georgians are expelled and then a conflict breaks out between Georgia and Abkhazia, and that could lead to wider Russian involvement. Another trend we've seen, interestingly, over the last several years has been the closure of the sealing of the border between Georgia proper and its two separatist regions. So previously it was still possible for people to go across that border, some minor trade took place. That's no longer allowed. I wouldn't say that this is the result of the Ukraine conflict since it precedes it, but it may be part of the same process of Russia hardening its position on the behavior of its post-Soviet neighbors. Okay, the final dimension which I would like to address is the internal politics of these three states. So I would say it's rather early to make a firm judgment, but it seems to me that the results of the Ukraine crisis have not been favorable toward the growth of democracy and the rule of law in these republics. Why is that? Well, for one thing, we've seen a kind of crackdown on dissent in a number of them. So Azerbaijan has just been imprisoning political opponents right and left and closing NGOs. Maybe this is a coincidence, it's happening for completely other reasons, but it certainly does fit into the argument that Azerbaijan is benefiting geopolitically and therefore is in a more powerful position to reject Western demands for some degree of toleration of political dissent. Something similar may be happening in Georgia. So as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, in 2012, there was a democratic transfer of government from the government to the opposition. Since then, we've seen a number of arrests and prosecutions and in some cases imprisonments of former officials under the previous government. President Saakashvili himself is no longer in Georgia, but this summer he was actually indicted by the Georgian government and some of his property was seized. So it's also arguable that in Georgia too, disenchantment with the West and a sense that the West is no longer all that important, or at least not capable of protecting Georgia, or at least not in a position to make demands on Georgia, that may be leading to this kind of crackdown on opposition. Another very strange development that I personally observed in the Caucasus, which I don't think has been really discussed that much in the academic literature yet, is what, for want of a better term, I'll call the activization of social conservatism. So over the last few years, those of us who watch what goes on in Russia have noticed that under President Putin, there's been an increasing emphasis on the Russian Orthodox Church as a source of identity, which has entailed things such as introducing religion classes in schools, giving religion a more prominent role in public life. And it's also entailed a kind of emphasis on what one might call, I don't know, traditional family and sexual values, so opposition to abortion, also strong opposition to gay rights. So this has been going on in Russia for a while, and people sort of thought it had something to do with President Putin's cultivation of a distinctive ideology for his regime. But now it seems to be happening in the Caucasus too. So that's unlikely to be a coincidence. So just to give you a few examples, in the Armenian debate about EU accession or the EU association agreement, these very issues of gender roles, abortion, and sexuality were all raised. When I was in Armenia, I actually interviewed a group of people working in a shelter for victims of domestic violence who had been physically threatened by extremist groups linked to the local church who saw them as completely depraved representatives of Western depravity. And similar kinds of arguments are being made in Georgia too. So a gay rights parade in Georgia was broken up a few years ago. So who is leading these? Who is leading this movement? Well, it's not coming out of thin air. There is some social conservatism in these societies, but it also seems to be somewhat mobilized through NGOs and through churches that are probably sympathetic to Russia. So I think it remains to be proved, but I think at least is a plausible suspicion that the government of Russia is in some ways deliberately activating this kind of social conservative movements as a way of drawing attention specifically to things about Western societies that local people may not like and that are presented as reasons not to join Western blocs such as the EU. All right, so what are the implications for us? So I put us in quotation marks because that's obviously a very contested concept, right? I'm just thinking about us as Canadian citizens who are concerned about events in this part of the world. Well, I think one clear message which I brought up at the beginning is the inadequacy of the resources that are given to our diplomats and our foreign services generally. Canada has an important part to play in these conflicts. It is in some ways a model of a confederal system that has managed ethnic conflict successfully. It's respected in the region, and yet it's very absent. So it's a shame that our profile there is not higher. That's a matter for us as Canadians specifically. What about the big question of NATO expansion that I opened with? Well, just to lay your cards on the table, in the interest of full disclosure, I have spent a lot of time in Georgia, and I've said publicly, or at least as a citizen, that I'm in favor of it. So I don't write about this academically. To me, it seems as though the arguments for it are now stronger than they were before, and the arguments against it are weaker. So I've just explained why I think that the claim that NATO membership for post-Soviet states is destabilizing, why that claim is no longer that viable. But I would also say that it seems to me that in some respects, we can actually make a stronger claim, right? So if we look at the countries that Russia has messed with in some ways, in the Caucasus and now Ukraine, they're not NATO members. So far, we have not seen similar interventions in Poland or the Baltics, which are. So I would turn around the claim that NATO membership is destabilizing and suggest that at least there's some evidence that's actually stabilizing, right? Because it makes clear that a final status quo has been reached that does not permit this kind of Russian intervention. You don't have to agree with me, right? I think I've made the argument that at a minimum, NATO expansion is not the bugbear that some people think it should be. Why don't we leave that? I'd also like to make a couple claims about just not so much what we should do, right, but how we should understand these events. So this goes back to two sets of related points about the nature of ethnic grievances in this broader region and the validity of these borders. So, I think here in Canada, we're in a good position to understand some of these issues, right? We have a linguistic divide in this country. It's reflected in bilingualism as an official policy. It's reflected in the confederal structure of the country and the special privileges that Quebec enjoys as a province. The idea that a state has to be monolingual, right, or that bicultural states or multi-ethnic states are unstable or in some ways weird, I think as Canadians, we're in a very strong position to say that that's wrong, right? Canada is a very successful state. It is not a classical nation state in the same way that France is or even the United States is. It doesn't make that kind of claim about itself. And yet, we're doing pretty well in the world, right? Earlier this year, with a colleague at McGill, Maria Popova, I co-authored an argument or an article in the Globe in which I made similar kinds of arguments about Ukraine, right? So a lot of the claims that Russia has been advancing about Ukraine have to do with the status of the Russian language, the feelings of people who speak Russian in Ukraine. And let me just make a few statements about this that may be news to some of you. So it's true, like Canada, Ukraine is a bilingual state. Most people in Ukraine speak both Ukrainian and Russian. There's more of a tendency for Ukrainian to be concentrated in the West as a native language and Russian in the East. Most people speak both to some degree. These are closely related Slavic languages. In eastern Ukraine, there has been some dissatisfaction over the years with previous government's policies of promoting Ukrainian language at the expense of Russian. These are real issues that Ukraine faces as a state. But the stronger version of the claim that Russia has enunciated or articulated is that, that the Russian minority in Ukraine is oppressed and needs protection. And that I cannot accept, right, for a number of reasons. So first of all, we have to remember that this whole region was part of the Soviet Union, and Russian was the national language. Almost everybody learned it and still speaks it to one degree or another. It's the lingua franca. It's just not the case that speaking Russian in this part of the world means that you are Russian or see yourself as Russian. So there are people in Ukraine who would say that they are ethnically Russian. That does exist, and those people, in fact, are concentrated in the Crimea. But there are plenty of other people who would say, well, I'm Ukrainian, but I prefer to speak Russian, right? It's the language I'm more comfortable in. I'd like it to have official status in my country. And there's nothing wrong with that position. It simply means, though, that we should not accept at face value the Russian claim that it's somehow needed as a protector of a Russian minority in Ukraine or elsewhere. So, to give you an analogy, right, Canada, some of us speak English, many of us have immigrant backgrounds, and our ancestors didn't speak English. It was the imperial language of the British Empire. We share it with the US, the UK, other Commonwealth countries. Some people speak French, right? This is not fatal for our integrity as a state. And it's certainly not a pretext for another state to intervene and carve up Canada. So I think we need to have a more nuanced view about the nature of identity in this part of the world. And just to give you another example, there are pockets of Russian speaking all over the post-Soviet region that I think people are not very aware of. One example that I know about is the Armenian minority in Georgia tends to prefer to speak Russian, right? So they say, Georgian, not a very valuable language. I'm going to learn Russian and send my children to Russian schools. That does not mean that people think they are ethnically Russian, right, or want to be citizens of Russia or want Russia's involvement in their politics. So I think the related point has to do with post-Soviet borders and how we should see them. So Russia has been making a number of claims about Ukraine's borders that I think are not really very serious. So Russia says relating to Crimea, well, this was part of Russia until 1954, I think it was, and then it was transferred to Ukraine by the Soviet government, and that was really undemocratic, and the people who live there don't like it, and we want it back, or at least they should be allowed to go if they want. And one could point out that previous governments of Russia recognized Ukraine's borders, so this objection was not brought up then. But let's leave that aside and just talk about what this border actually means and why it should be respected or not. All borders are artificial. They're all political. They're political constructs, right? Our border with the United States is a result of a number of wars. We also have in Canada a region, Quebec, where there is some separatist sentiment, right? Some people in Quebec would prefer to be independent, a minority at this stage, but a large one. That was true in Crimea, right? It's not a justification for breaking up Canada or calling its borders into question. The borders of Ukraine are not any more artificial than those of any other post-Soviet state, and that is true in the Caucasus as well, right? So the Russian claim that these borders should be re-examined because they're in some way undesirable, right, or historically unjust. They're neither more nor less historically unjust than a lot of other borders. People who live in these countries have very complex identities. And at a minimum, we should be highly skeptical of the claims that the borders have to be, this can of worms, this Pandora's box should be reopened. I think actually as Canadians, we're in a strong position to say that, right? Like we've made a go of it as a country. We have an ethnic minority that has a separatist component in Quebec province. It hasn't stopped us from being very successful. We are a successful country. We're a very democratic country. We would like our borders to be respected and to be treated as permanent. It's not that borders are sacred, right? They're political constructs, but they are a source of stability in the world. And in Ukraine, Russia's behavior has been very destabilizing. And I think we'd have to go back to the Caucasus, and we could go back to the Caucasus and say that similar things are true with its behavior with respect to the borders of Georgia, right? This is also a region with ethnic minorities. Similar arguments have been advanced. The government of Azerbaijan makes the same claim about Nagorno-Karabakh. So maybe, without wading into that question, I would say that a further point for us as citizens and for our government, right, has to be this question of post-Soviet borders needs to be examined in its totality, right? And the validity of these borders and the claims of these unhappy ethnic minorities and or the separatist entities in which they live should be addressed, right? So if we're going to answer Russia's claim that the annexation of Crimea is illegitimate, this whole issue needs to be actually brought up and understood in some systematic way. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the public discussion of Ukraine has not done that. All right, so I'm sure that my presentation has made a lot of people very annoyed. And I'm looking forward to a stimulating discussion. So thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take your questions.